Before I invite Edward Lister to speak, I thought I would make a couple of comments, partly for his benefit, and also to build on what I think has been an extremely rich and collegial morning. And I've got just a couple of things I'd like to say. First is, and it all relates in a sense to politics. First is a sense that what has been very damaging in many of our democracies is the high degree to which the electorate is polarized, and polarized away from the center, which is shrunk. And if we think about this, why people have broadly divergent views and views that are increasingly difficult to reconcile, is that everybody's fearful of the future, but defines the future in very different ways. And so what they're concerned about doesn't easily shape a common agenda. And what we've been missing is a sense of how things will be better when the crisis is over. The hope that comes with fear. This is an old theme that goes back easily into the 17th century, Spinoza, that these two things are twin. Well, we're not seeing quite the hope that comes with the fear. The second point, which I think has come across this morning also, is that our states are not designed to cope with the kinds of problems that they face, not just the crisis, which I think is it's quite revealing that our states are not really equipped. We said in 2008 the state is back. I think we misspoke. It's the central bank that's back. And the central bank is independent. Central bankers are the, speak about central bankers, central banks, but it's not the state. And the third is that, and it's related to this, is that the changes underway, of which we can speak immediately about the crisis, but not only again about the crisis, is that there is increasing autonomy, increasing scope for things to happen at the urban and regional level. It's not delegated by constitutions necessarily or by political reforms, but because states are increasingly constrained, there is less they can do to impede initiatives at the urban and regional level. Whether those jurisdictions respond to the challenge is another question. They may or may not. I think it was very interesting in Peter Hall's presentation this morning is the important role of mayors in continental countries. You could make your own inferences for England. But if the urban and regional levels are more and more, let's say, relatively more important, it means paying attention not only to physical capital, but to human and social capital. And their complementarity with the physical. It's this interaction that we are talking about more sequentially than holistically. And finally, the question of data, whether better data will help, what kind of data, and so on. And if you allow me an anecdote from the OECD, which has this vast database on urban and regional economies, it was created not to create a vast database, but to solve a problem. And the problem was the relationship between education and employment in depressed cities. There we had a project in the late 1990s looking at 5 cities and their regions in Europe. And we realized that to make any judgment about those localities, we had to look at a larger set of similar and dissimilar places to assess relevant outcomes, not only in those countries, but internationally. And that the need to have that kind of data was really what originally led to the creation of the OECD database on subnational economies. It was driven by a question. We know roughly now what some of the answers are, but we couldn't have done it without data. And of course, it's always an interest to me when we released at then I was at the OECD Government at a Glance, the first edition. We thought, these are the questions that really will drive research. And then we looked about a month or so later, we found out the journalists and the academics had picked up all sorts of things that we hadn't listed high on our list of priorities. So data is very important because it speaks to us in many, many different ways. I have the pleasure of inviting Sir Edward Lister, the Chief of Staff and Deputy Mayor for Policy and Planning of London, to address us. He cannot regrettably stay much beyond, I think, his remarks this afternoon for reasons of schedules and problems that have to be solved probably before the day is out. These are things that we all understand. We're very grateful that you are here and with us.
Thank you very much. I apologise I can't stay for the afternoon because I'd very much like to. But I've just come back from doing something in China and I'm going back off again next week somewhere else. So it's all a bit mad for me at the moment, and I apologise. But anyway, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity of coming along and saying a few words this afternoon. And I obviously am going to really concentrate on, in my remarks, mainly about London as the example of the city, because that's the city I know, that's the city I understand. And I think it's a good example of the challenges facing a city. And I think the first tenet is, and I'm sure you've talked about this from those comments, that all over the world, society is dependent on their cities, population hubs, which are driving the economies of the country. And this really is the first tenet, that the city really, its role is to provide economic growth for its population. So that's the first thing. It's also a focus of urban development and competition between centres, and that increases the quality of life within the city. And I pulled out a quote from Edward Glazier, which I wanted to quote. Cities are the nodes that connect our increasingly globalised world. Not every city will succeed because not every city has been adept at adapting to the age of information in which ideas are the ultimate creator of wealth. And I'll come back to that quote as I develop my proposition. In order to develop planning policy, certainly in London, we always have to look at the demographic context of the city. And in 1950, less than 1 in 3 people lived in a city, and there were just 2 mega cities in the world, New York and Tokyo. Now, half the world's population lives in cities or in urban areas, and the UN, there's a report out there which says that that's increasing by 180,000 people on a daily basis. So parts of the developing world are experiencing urbanisation at a rate we cannot really comprehend, and certainly was far, far in excess of anything we ever experienced in this country, particularly in the 19th century. The other one, of course, is that the world economy is tilting to the east and to the BRIC countries, and there's a major structural change at play there. And that raises a couple of obvious questions: how and what they trade with these new markets, and how they successfully attract inward investment. And those are 2 very key questions for all cities. And there's a recent study by McKinsey, which I quote an awful lot, so I particularly quote it when I'm going over to places like China. And that is that it suggests that larger cities attract the most talent and the most investment, and that it is the cities which will always stimulate growth. And the report, and the key bit in the report, when they analyse the world's top 600 cities, based on GDP, is that by 2025, 136 of those 600 will move out of the list, and they're nearly all in the West. and 136 new cities will move onto the list, and they're nearly all in the east. And that is the shift which is taking place. But when you see the size, the economic generation, the economic effect of those cities in the east, one really can see the change taking place. And the other point, of course, is for us in the west, our population is getting older and is declining compared to their populations, which are, of course, younger and increasing. And of course, if you actually believe a young population is also one of the drivers to economic prosperity, that's a further major challenge for those of us in the West. However, let's talk about London. And London has a remarkable history of adapting and evolving. I mean, its docks were the centre of its trade in the 19th century, and much of our economy was based on those docks. And here we are in the 21st century, and we're rebuilding docks to the east of London, which have got a capacity not much short of Rotterdam, in a very small area. And I'm talking there about the Thames Gateway Port, which has just finished construction. And I use that purely as an example of an evolving, changing city. And at varying times, the city has led other things. It led in printing, it's led in other areas. And it continues to lead today in certain areas. It continues to lead very solidly in banking. Even with a recession, it leads in all the financial services. In financial services, I don't even comprehend, and I don't even know I don't even understand them. But they're growing and expanding and employing lots of people. We're growing fast in IT, we're growing fast in biomed. Those are growth areas. And so the city has changed. It's moved on from what it was today. And I mean, just dealing with financial services, we estimate at City Hall that financial services are worth, including all the ripple effects, 665,000 jobs. That includes everything that goes with them. But we are seeing changes taking place. New areas are coming in. We are much more artistic, we are much more cultural, we are much more into media. These are massive growth industries in London. And then I touched on some of the new technologies that are taking place, like IT and the sort of tech city type work. Tech city is a good example. Basically, and it doesn't really matter what government ever says, although it claims great credit for it, and so do we, of course. But you know, Tech City is basically 3,500 firms, 40,000 jobs created in a matter of only a few years, and it actually was created totally under the radar, with nobody ever really seeing it take place. It just evolved in East London. Probably the biggest single driver was low rents, if we ever really got to the truth of the matter. Okay, so that's that issue. Moving on, population. I must talk a bit about population, because our population is changing dramatically. Back in 1939, we had a population of 8.6 million. We were the most populous city in the UK. Abercrombie report came along in 1944. Big cities are bad. Population started to move out. New cities created, new towns created, population on the move. And the population steadily falls. And we go through a period of the population collapsing down, and then somewhere in the sort of late 70s, 80s, it swung the other way, started to climb up pretty solidly till today. We're on 8.4 million. By 2015-16, we'll be at 8.6 million. We'll be back to our peak number. By 2020, we'll be on 9 million. By 2030, we'll be on 10 million, and so I go on, although our estimates are that soon after 2030, the population will actually start to flatten out. But nevertheless, that's a major change. So what does that mean? Well, our London plan, which is our Bible for planning purposes, says we need 32,000 housing units of all types constructed each year. Good year, we'll build 25,000, maybe in a really good year we'll build 27,000. So we never actually ever get to 32,000, but that's our plan. We're doing some work at the moment based on the population numbers I quoted earlier, based on some of the other information we've got, and we'll be in a position around Christmas time to actually firm this up. But we reckon our population needs will be somewhere in the order of 50,000 housing units a year. So in effect, we need to double housing production to meet our needs. And that is a major pressure. But it doesn't stop there, because you also need 500,000 more jobs, you need more and different types of retail space, you need a fundamental change in the supply of transport, and I will come back to that in a minute, but hey, we're expanding our transport network between now and 2020 by 30% with Crossrail and some of the other things, but we have to go well north of that if we're going to meet these kind of population numbers. And just on schooling, our estimate is that we need about 190,000 school places, additional school places, by 2020. And that in itself is a major challenge. So those are the sort of challenges that are out there, and certainly for the next couple of decades, we're going to be talking about enormous growth, enormous expansion. Now that is not unique to this city. That is more of a profile of a Chinese city or an Indian city or a Far East city of some description, this massive population boom. It is not the profile of a European city, because European cities are getting older and the population is declining, and that is still the case today. Now, there are exceptions, of course, but generally that's the trend. So London is very much bucking a trend in the West. So how do we ever as planners, ever think about how are we going to meet some of those demands? Well, there are a few good things for us as a city, and indeed for all cities, is of course that we are major reservoirs of brownfield land. Some of those old industries I talked about earlier, of course, moved on, times have changed, and opportunities occur. And that gives us some of the opportunity areas that we need to create the sort of housing, sort of jobs that we need. And we reckon that we can get, and we're fairly happy with this estimate, that we will get about 2/3 of our population growth needs can be met from within the city with our current plans. That's not good enough. We need more than that, but it gives you some feeling about the amount of development potential there is in parts of London. And those opportunity areas, though, have one thing in common if you think about them. I'm talking about areas like Barking Riverside, the Upper Lee Valley, sort of Tottenham, Croydon, or more immediate ones which are being built out at the moment, Vauxhall, Nine Elms, Elephant and Castle, White City, those areas. They nearly all have one thing in common, and that is that there was a reason that they missed all the property booms of the last 10, 15 years. And that nearly is in every case an infrastructure deficit of some kind, mainly transport related, but not exclusively transport related. And that is the deficit that if you actually want to build and expand and meet the demands, we've got to put right on the way. But the point about it is that those are the areas where the city can expand. We also need to look at what's our potential, both long term and short term. What are the economic challenges? What's the right areas to look at? What are we going to do with the skyline? Where are we going to increase the densities? How are we going to increase the densities? We have some high-rise areas. The city is a great example, and you just watch the sort of cheese grater shooting up on the walkie-talkie if you don't get blinded, or something else by the heat rays coming from it. You know, all these buildings, but they are going up, and the city is becoming very high-rise. Round Canary Wharf, similarly, you've got a big high-rise area, but it doesn't stop there. The Vauxhall Nine Elms area is a high-rise area, more akin to Manhattan when it's built out than it is to the traditional London that we know. Elephant and Castle, similarly, is going that way. It will be large apartment blocks, far more dense than anything we've had before. What are some of the other issues? I touched on our opportunity areas. Just out of interest to you, those areas I named earlier, they're of about 250,000 homes and about 500,000 jobs. So they're pretty significant reservoirs for the city. But then you've got growth areas like the Thames Gateway and what we're doing down the Gateway, up on the sort of corridor towards Cambridge to the north and some of the other areas. We have the Central Activity Zone around here. How is that changing? How is that evolving? What are we doing within it? We have enterprise zones in the Royal Docks to the east, which is a totally new way of funding things. We've got Vauxhall 9 Elms, which is an enterprise zone. But it's an enterprise zone not to create incentives for business. It's an enterprise zone to create a funding mechanism for infrastructure. And we're using the enterprise zone as a system of collecting value uplift from the business rates, something we've never really done in this country before. And it's more of an American TIF model type thing, and that's underway there. Other challenges, we have 200 high streets in London. 200 high streets are not going to survive in the world of the fast-growing internet shopping, where London is one of the leading cities for internet shopping. So that is radically changing what those high streets are going to look like. And if you talk to some of the big firms like John Lewis or any of those, they openly admit that their shops are as much showrooms as they are somewhere where you go and buy. You may buy, but you may also just look and then go straight online and buy what you want to buy for your best source. That's affecting the high street. It's also affecting distribution. So now we're under a major pressure for more warehousing, more distribution centres which are more local to the people that are there. And then that go back to the high streets. The high streets, everybody wants large floor plates. They want less of them. They want it much shorter, much more compact, centres of the nighttime economy. So those big, long, straggling high streets are all basically dying. And, you know, we can go on and talk about that. But the barrier to all of this, and I think I'll come back to it, and it's true for all cities, is how do you fund what you've got to fund for it to grow? And transport infrastructure is an extremely important thing, extremely expensive thing to pay for. We're talking just the Northern Line extension in Vauxhall 9 Elms, 2 stations and a bit of tunnel. I think it's 3 kilometres in length of tunnel, all relatively small, small scale, and that's over £1 billion having to be spent just on that one very small project. And we've got lots of those around the city. So how do you fund things like this going forward when the public purse is getting shorter and shorter? Let alone all the school expansions, the health requirements, all the other things that are taking place as well. So the funding is a major challenge. We're doing some work at the moment, and we'll complete that as well early next year. But we're actually trying to price the cost of all this. We're actually trying to put a bill on it. We're creating a long-term infrastructure plan through to 2050. The reason we're going through to 2050 is because we're assuming we need 25-year payback periods. So to get a picture for 2025, you've got to go through to 2050 in your thinking. And so we're doing that work at the moment, and that'll help us put some numbers on it. But just something small, like, for example, electrical substations, and we need about 6 more of those in London urgently at the moment. There's 40 to 50 million pounds a time. And that's got to be paid for into the system. And you go on like that all the time. So that's the big challenge. So that's why we're running some pretty strong arguments with government about fiscal autonomy. We're doing that both individually as a city, but we're now, and the Mayor's just announced it, we're doing it jointly with the core cities, the Manchesters, the Leeds, Birminghams of this world, that we're all and doing some more work, doing some more research work, but we're all basically arguing the same thing, and that is you've got to give cities greater access to the tax base that's out there. Not, I stress, for more revenue and running costs. We all accept those days are gone, but you've got to give us access to the borrowing power of that money, the capital that can be released from it. That's the bit we all want. Nobody's arguing for more running costs. It is capital that we need to pay for the sort of infrastructure improvements, the sort of changes that as cities we need. And if we can sort those kind of things out, we believe we can fund the sort of things that we need to do to build up the population that we need and therefore have a very competitive city. But that's the challenge that we face. And I hope that, well, maybe useful for debate and useful as a talking point.
Thank you. One of the paradoxes of this crisis, when I sometimes talk to people in the private sector, is that money is not the problem. We have the money. We lack the projects. We lack regulatory certainty. What will the price of electricity be for the running costs of the projects, et cetera, et cetera? Will there be a carbon tax? Will there be restrictions of this or of that? And governments, I don't know.
Well, I think to be fair, that's right. I mean, I don't think money is the problem. I think political will is often the problem, but money per se is not necessarily the problem. I mean, I speak on a very regular basis to people with lots of money. One's now reaching the stage where we're running out of schemes to try and pitch to them, to try and get them to put money into, because what they want is certainty with those schemes. And every time somebody starts talking about mention taxes or any form of tax change or any regulation variation of any kind, it doesn't matter what it is, you just get them all frightened and jittery, and then they put off making the funding decision. And that happens all the time. And that is the big challenge. I mean, it's about certainty and clarity, but it's also about speed. We spend too long making decisions. It's not that we have a planning process that's particularly inflexible or indeed over-bureaucratic. It's a planning process that takes too long. The planning itself is actually not the problem and never has been. It's all the hang-ons that go with it that create the uncertainty. And it can't be right that we talk about a planning system that processes a reasonably large-scale scheme, which says from the point a planning application goes in, and if you assume the period up to that is the design time, it takes 16 weeks to process a planning application, and then that's the end of the matter. Well, it isn't the end of the matter, because as any developer will tell you, with a friendly local authority and a good following wind, it's 2 years. And with a difficult local authority and a few JRs and other things, well, stick another year or two on. And that's the bit we can't live with. We've got to speed that whole machine up, and we have to move much more towards presumption, towards development, not the other way around. And that's the issue which we as a city are constantly having to argue.
Yes. Other questions from the floor, please?
Oh, yeah, no, fine.
You mentioned that certainty, clarity, and speed are the most important things for developers. What role do you see local authorities having in providing that certainty, and what examples could you bring forward from kind of GLA's experience or London's experience of providing certainty and clarity, especially with so much policy?
I think the first issue is that local authorities generally, and this is a sweeping statement, I know, really in my book fall into three categories. Those that have a very clear vision of where they want to go, You may or may not agree with the vision. That's never the point here. They have a vision and they know where they're trying to get to. At the other end of the scale, there's a group that really haven't a clue what they're doing. I think they have difficulty finding their own building. And then there's a chunk in the middle which just coasts. Now, I suppose that's true of life, generally. But it is true that those authorities which have got a vision and know where they're trying to go to are the ones that are coming off the starting blocks much, much quicker, because they are creating certainty. Either a certainty that the developer or the project or whatever it is feels that they can communicate and get it off the ground, or they may feel it's not for them and they're not even going near the place, but at least they know where they are, and nobody wastes time and it moves forward quite quickly. Good example of this is probably in Newham, the Siemens Centre. That was conceived at the World Economic Forum in Davos one wintry January. And from conception there, it was then worked up as a scheme. A site was identified, architects were appointed, planning was processed, the building was built, and it was open for business. Admittedly, not quite fully operational, but at least it was open 18 months later. And that was a £35 million project from start to finish in 18 months, from conception to completion. It can be done, but there has to be a willingness, a real willingness to just push the whole thing through. Now, in that case, there were certain advantages. The land was publicly owned land. The borough wanted it. City Hall wanted it. So we were at a position where everybody wanted it. But even so, it's going some to do it in 18 months. But we shouldn't be looking at that in amazement, which we do, and saying, why aren't we doing that more often? Why do we find it quite so difficult? So there are examples. We are getting better. It's often small things which are being cleared up at the moment and helping the system move forward. And we just have to keep going at that. But those authorities that have a vision certainly are getting there and are moving. And I think you do see that in certain parts of London. You do really see what's happening in some corners. I mean, can I say so? I don't know if any of you have been down the sort of the Vauxhall 9 Elms area. I mean, it's enormous, the demolition that's going on, the number of cranes that are in the air, the number of schemes with different developers which are on the move. Similarly, by early part of next year, Elephant and Castle will be like that once they start demolishing the Haygate estate, which will start shortly. In fact, I think it's started. You're seeing those corners of London really moving.
Tony.
Could I are able to say a little bit more about access to the tax base and which particular tax base? Is this the property tax, business rates, or is this sales tax?
No, it's a good question. We did some work, and we've come. We did some work in conjunction. We set up a London Finance Commission under a guy called Tony Travers, who was the chairman of it, they gathered quite a group of people together to look at this, and they came to the conclusion the one they should be looking at was the property tax base. So it's the business rates, it's the council tax, it's stamp duty, it's that tax I never remember the name of, but if you're a foreign corporation buying a house you have to pay, which I'm sorry, it's a tax name that's completely that's that little collection of taxes. We did have a lot of discussion about sales tax, and it was an interesting one, things like hotel taxes, that kind of thing. But the view was that it was all relatively small sums of money. There may be a reason to go into something like, say, hotel taxes, if you had a specific reason for it, and it was very closely allied to something, I don't know. If you tied it into the London museums, you'd have a sort of logic to it, which might make it sellable. But our view was, unless it had that, it was never going to be sellable, so don't even go there. Stick to the property ones, because it is probably true that because of the way we've got them structured at the moment, they are dysfunctional anyway. That stamp duty is a disincentive at the moment, a severe disincentive. And if you had the whole range of property taxes, without putting business tax up or doing something silly, you could probably get a greater tax take by rationalising what you had. But it would, for us, give us a certainty, and indeed for the boroughs, a certainty of funding, which would enable you to get the borrowings that you need to build the kind of things that a city needs to build. And that's where we were looking.
Well, thank you very, very much
Thank you.
for joining us, and it's been very stimulating to have your list, particularly because I think it flows backwards and forwards in the morning to the end of the day. Begging the question, those jurisdictions that have a vision, whether they're at a small scale or at a large scale, when a local district, a local authority has a vision, what is the implication of its vision on the other jurisdictions around it or even beyond it, and how can we scale up?
Yeah, and I think that is the right question, and for me, but also what is undoubtedly true is that they do put pressure on their neighbours, and it does help drive the whole city forward, because of course if people want to see change and development and they want to see things happen, and they look at what's happening nearby them, they will run with it. And it does. Good practice always works as an example, and it does move forward. And in many ways, I mean, I'm very excited actually, because I think London is changing. I think it's changing for the better, and it's changing fast. And we are coping with our challenges. And if the economy moves as it's continued to, I mean, even in the depths of the recession, London's share of GDP didn't drop that much, and today it's increasing. You could actually argue its share of GDP is now too high for the good of the country. It's 23%, and the rest of the southeast another 22%. So nigh on half the country is in the southeast.
The other problem is that GDP is not as high as it would have been had there been no recession.
Correct. Yes. Well,
which would change the ratios and so on. But
thank you.
Again, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.